Hey everyone, my name's Cody Benjamin, proud to be part of the Mankato community, and just wanted to officially welcome you in to Indivisible for Justice, our panel discussion here. Whether you're just joining us now, this is your first piece of engagement during this initiative, or whether you ordered Indivisible for Justice apparel to support a good cause, or whether you came out to some of our tables that we had set up downtown and got some free resources. Regardless, I just want to welcome you in. We're excited to have you. I mean, this is a community endeavor. This discussion that we're about to have, it isn't just a bunch of people saying what needs to be said. It's trying to raise engagement, to raise conversations in your own homes, in your own families, in your own workplaces, because this is it's an important time in our country, in our community, of kind of having uncomfortable conversations. I think Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, he puts it better than I can, the way he kind of describes what's going on. He says, as a country, we tend to want to take ownership of our country when it achieves good things. You think of the example of the Olympics. If America goes and wins a bunch of gold medals at the Olympics, we like to say, did you see what we did? And obviously it wasn't us that went and won gold medals. It wasn't you or I, but we take ownership because it's something to be proud of. But he challenges us because, a lot of us, or some of us more than other communities, hesitate to take ownership when there are unfortunate things that happen. We hesitate to take ownership or implicate ourselves in the bad things, the bad parts of our country's history. And we know that specifically, what we're talking about now is racial injustice, and something that's been happening for a long time. And so specifically in regards to voting, we know that voting is certainly not the only way we tackle these kind of conversations, but it's one piece. And so in the discussion that follows, we really just want to welcome you into a dialogue that touches on not only racial justice, how that might be playing out in our communities, but also nationally, but how we can get involved, how we can use our vote well, how we can use it to, if we do care about racial justice, to kind of see that play out in our communities. And then also to address the notion that racial injustice just doesn't exist. I mean, we have some of our leaders that will address that. And I am proud I mentioned, proud to be part of the Mankato community, but maybe even more proud that we do have local leaders that care about this and don't just want to talk about it, but want to raise conversations with other people who may not agree with them fully. And also not only that, but act on these issues, to use our vote, not only our vote, but our willingness to engage in community to kind of bring about change. So what follows, over the past few weeks, I've had the opportunity, the privilege, the pleasure of sitting down with three different local leaders in different areas of life, in just the community, in the political realm, in the academic realm, in the spiritual, the church. I had a chance to sit down with these people, and they kind of answered my questions about some things. And I hope that, this dialogue would just challenge you to have your own conversations and perhaps inform you on how you can use your vote to make racial justice a priority. You might not agree fully with everything each of these speakers says. In fact, even the speakers themselves aren't necessarily 100% aligned as far as what they might view as the best route forward. But this is a conversation. We want to have it. We want to bring in different perspectives, and I just would invite you to go in with an open mind and be willing to hear what they have to say. We also have some information at the close about how specifically Indivisible and their Postcard Project are working towards this cause. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to our panel of speakers.
I'm Dr. Kate Knutson. I am Professor of Political Science at Gustavus Adolphus College and Chair of the Political Science Department.
So Maurice Staley, I pastor Faith Bible Church in Mapleton, Minnesota. I also pastor House of Worship Church here in Mapleton, Minnesota. I'm the acting president of the NAACP chapter. It's pretty much formed, a few more legalities, but we're pretty much able to operate in full function.
Bukata Hayes, two roles really, three. One, executive director of the Greater Mankato Diversity Council, co-founder of a consulting company called Love and Struggle, and then father and husband and son and brother.
The most important ones.
That's right. I think that there's a long and really documented history of first race dictating like political outcomes, right? And so I think if we look throughout the history, we could go to the Willie Horton ad that ran in the Michael Dukakis race. We could go to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the election of 1968. We can go to Reconstruction. We can go to kind of the founding of our country, in particular within the documents around African Americans or freed slaves not being considered fully human, so that you didn't completely flip a representation, because all those freed slaves would be able to vote, and that they would impact how our kind of electoral landscape would look. And so I think I would offer that there really isn't politics without the thread of race through it. And so if we're going to talk about racial justice and now how we kind of transform our systems to, through the legislative arm and through politics to really acknowledge race's role throughout our political kind of existence, and to reconcile race's impact upon our political behaviors and existence, I think we have to talk about racial justice and how racial justice really is, I think, part and parcel of what we have to do going forward politically.
I think sometimes you see pushback from people when there's, for instance, the George Floyd incident, and you want to talk about injustice that's going on, and some people will suggest, well, that's getting political to try and talk about racial issues. But would you say that, a lot of your interest in engaging this politically comes from just wanting to better your community? This isn't about, just aligning with one party all the time. Right. It's more about responding to things that are going on. Is that
absolutely? Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I think the one thing we can say as well is that, like, when we talk about racial justice, one, we're acknowledging that policies, legislation is not aracial, right? That it absolutely impacts racially.
It's not that an individual person is out there being racist. It's that the way that the structure is created leads to racist outcomes. That's what institutional or systemic racism is about. And so where we see that play out has to do with things that on their face don't have a racial tinge to them, right? So we don't have laws that say Black people can't vote. We did have those laws at one point, but we don't have those now. But just because we don't have that law now doesn't mean that the system is still equal. And so the way around those kinds of laws, which for the most part the Supreme Court has ruled those kinds of laws are unconstitutional, the way around that is to create laws that don't explicitly mention race, but still have racist implications. So a law that seems what we would call racially neutral, like voter ID, right? Seems like a great idea. People should have an identification required in order to vote. That seems very non-racial, right? It's not saying certain groups have to have an ID or certain groups, are barred from voting. The way it becomes systemic or institutional racism is that we know that there are patterns in terms of who has access to voter ID. Right? The type of ID that would be required under those laws. We know that certain groups are less likely to have driver's licenses. Certain groups are less likely to have access to their birth certificate that they might need to prove in order to be able to register to vote. That there are costs associated with those things, right? If I want to print out a copy of my birth certificate, it's not free. I don't just go Google it. I have to go down to a courthouse. I have to pay for that, right? And so those structural inequalities in terms of who has access are what leads to the disparities of some people, a supposedly race-neutral law having disparate effects on different racial groups. In South Dakota is a great example where we're seeing that in terms of needing a street address in order to register to vote. And you think about who doesn't have a street address. And people that have P.O. boxes don't have a street address, but also a lot of people on Native American reservations don't have a street address. And so that would automatically disenfranchise you from being able to register to vote. So those are some specific examples where we see the laws themselves don't explicitly call out race. So they don't fit our traditional definition of a racist policy. But the race-neutral laws, as they're written, that don't mention race, have racial implications, and that's how they become an example of institutional or systemic racism.
And so I think that's the first thing that I would say is involved in racial justice, is that we have this truth-telling. If we're talking about the murder of George Floyd, and then we're talking about how we have to reform, transform, some would say abolish, police, that in itself, right? Like that is a response to like this overwhelming body of evidence that shows like black and brown folks don't get treated the same, right, from this particular entity, but that entity is upheld by a number of policies and statutes and legislations that allows that unfair treatment to continue. So if we're going, no, that's not political. Like that's folks' existence, right? The political is personal, right? So those rules, statutes, laws impact folks personally. And so I think I would simply say, for those who would say you're getting political, one, I would say, yeah, you're right. Because we understand the way to consolidate gains, to really provide the priority and the financial backing to transform systems that are racially unjust right now is through legislation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and you mentioned like the police, that's one example. I mean, what are some specific policies or topics today, whether it's in Mankato or whether you're talking on a national level, people that are watching and want to get involved, what kind of specific things do they need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think so. One is kind of how our public safety or police departments may be structured, right? So public safety right now is responding to a lot of calls, right, in which other services or other resources can be implemented to help. So maybe it's mental health, maybe it's substance abuse, right? So there's these things that police officers, public safety and police departments in general are having to respond to that we could, and this is some of the defund, is to say no, but there's other ways we can invest those funds in community to make sure that police are really about peacekeeping, public safety, and not mental health counselors, substance abuse responders. They're even taking a look at school resource officers, right, as a way not to, in a sense, condition school-aged children, right, to having an officer in the building. And then that officer responding, right, and through that officer responding, there is some sort of record that is created, whereas maybe if you had somebody else, right, behavior specialists or other folks, that engagement would not trigger a entry into the criminal justice system. It would simply trigger this response from a school, right, to provide services to that student so that they can do better. So I think those are some of the things that folks in terms of policies and legislations will be looking at. I think some of the other things, right, is that if we're really about accountability, maybe it's use of force, maybe it's arrest, citations, or warnings. Like I think this really clear data that then is provided to community so that community understands, and so that public safety is saying we want to be held accountable. Community understands that that's the information that we will be getting as we try and reduce disparities between the percentage of the population of folks of color who live here and the percentage that those folks of color are encountered with public safety, right? There should be some sort of leveling there, that if I'm 12% of a population, that I should be somewhere around that 12%, right, within a margin of error of those interactions with public safety. But if I'm 12% of a population and I'm 50% of those interactions within public safety that result in arrest or use of force or whatever, like, there's something wrong there, right? So I think here locally, one, that really transparency of data, I think is something that is absolutely being talked about, is a possibility. And then also when it comes to the other end of the criminal justice system, and I think we often forget about we may be, and I get this from Brian Stevenson, right? He talks about we may be guilty of a crime but unfairly sentenced, right? So it also, I think we have to begin to look at like this other part of the criminal justice system where we're kind of focusing on policing because we see what policing does and the damage that it causes to black and brown bodies. But we also need to understand that there is this other arm in which I may be rightly convicted but wrongly sentenced, right? So instead of me getting what would be typical, right, for this offense, I get something more, right? And so I think that's the other part that we have to begin to be earnest in looking at is, so what do we have disparities in sentencing here in Blue Earth and Nicollet County? And if we do, what are we going to do about it?
And so we want to bring issues of the disenfranchised to the table, and we're going to be doing some of that with the NAACP to kind of see what our local representatives will be willing to do for the afflicted and what their plan is to bring justice for the poor.
And I think we have a really good chance here in our region to kind of partner with our public safety, partner with judges to try and make those things more equitable.
Beyond just raising these questions or having these conversations, we're talking about also just going to the polls. And we're not necessarily telling people who to vote for here.
No, absolutely.
But how would you, for the average person that's like, I want to do something here,
right,
and I want to use my vote well, what kind of advice can you give at all for them?
So one, first, vote. Like, vote. Like, I personally, right, I know who I'm supporting. I know the policies and statutes that I'm voting for, but you got to vote, right? I think, and I use this example a lot, but, Malcolm X talked about in the Ballad of the Bullet, right? And you got to remember, Malcolm X was assassinated before he was 39, so was in the movement in his late 20s and throughout. And he was his famous phrase is by any means necessary, right? So I want folks to understand that by any means necessary, that I think sometimes it get misconstrued as only this physical response, right? That he said, I'm not going to be nonviolent, as compared to Martin Luther King's nonviolent stance. So some folks only see that as this violent response. But what he was saying is by any means necessary is exactly that, right? And in the Ballad of the Bullet, he talks about America has a chance to engage in a bloodless revolution. And that bloodless revolution is voting. That we will go out because we have the numbers. And at this time, he was talking about Black America. Black America has the numbers to tip any election in their candidate's favor if they go out and vote, right? And so when we talk about like voting, and I'm going to speak specifically for Black community, like every one of our Black leaders have talked about the importance of going out to vote. Angela Davis just recently said that, like, and folks know Angela Davis, she's never really belonged to a mainstream party, but she said, we got to go vote, right? And so I think how can folks get started? One is simply go out and vote. Like, that's the most powerful weapon that we have as citizens engaged in democracy is our vote. And we couple that with millions of other folks who are voting. And then the other part is to start to try and get educated, right? Understand that all the candidates have platforms, websites. Go Google it, right? Like, go Google it, see what those candidates are standing for, and then in particular, if you are understanding the role that race has played in our history's elections and politics, and you're saying I want to vote for racially just policies and procedures. One, go examine those platforms, right, and see, do they call out race? racial disparities, narrowing those racial disparities, eliminating those racial disparities in their policies around education, right? Health, income, housing, public safety, criminal justice, mass incarceration. And I think that's what I would give, right, to folks who are looking to get involved, don't know where to start. But if you're talking about racial justice and voting, I would say go look at the platforms, see who's calling out race and what they want to do for our community and our country.
There is a difference in candidates in terms of who thinks it should be easier to vote because it's an important civic duty, who thinks it should be more difficult to vote. And I think that for people that care about access, you want to be supporting candidates that want to make it easier to vote. I think any issue you pick, you're going to be able to find racial disparities in it. And so I think, for people that care about healthcare, for people who care about education, for people who care about criminal justice, for people who care about child welfare, you take any topic and there are racial disparities. And that's because we have systemic racism built into those systems. And so I think there are places where anybody who has any interest can get plugged in. And part of the first step is, I think, learning about it. Because if you care about healthcare, right, if healthcare is an issue, access to healthcare or the price of healthcare is an issue that you have cared about for a while, you might not know that there's disparities in who has access to healthcare that are based on race, or in health outcomes that are based on race, right? You might not know that the maternal health rates for Black mothers are way worse than the maternal health rates for white mothers, right? It just might not be something that you're aware of, even though you care about the issue. So I think the first place to start is just learning more about it. And then once you know more about it, then you can start to think about that through the political lens of asking candidates questions about that, right? So it's not just about your position on the minimum wage. It's about your position on the minimum wage as it relates to these structural issues about the wage gap that exists between African Americans and white Americans, or Native Americans and white Americans. So I think that no matter what your issue is, it has a racial dimension to it, and it's just something that's not, for most people, most white people, it's not something that they've ever thought about before. But it's there if they bother to take the time to look at it.
Well, there's certainly a different response. And once again, the two churches I pastor, one is predominantly, if not all white, and then one is predominantly, if not all Black. And so you have different perspectives, different comprehensions of what's going on in our society. I start with 2 Corinthians 5:14 through 21. And I'll just leave that for our viewers to look that up. And I guess just succinctly, very briefly, God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to reconcile the world to himself. He sent him who knew no sin. So Jesus was totally oblivious to sin, but he took on sin for our behalf, that we might be saved and receive eternal life. So I think if you take that application, Jesus not knowing about something, yet because of God's wanting righteousness to be in the earth, he took on that. And so that's usually where I start with my brothers and sisters of a lighter hue. I challenge them because Black Americans experience something totally different from white Americans. My fault, your fault, nobody's fault, but it really takes a concentrated effort for a believer in Jesus Christ to look at what they have, to no fault of their own, been able to experience in our great nation. And so it's a challenge. There are many layers to it. And so I start there, and I like to take on questions, and I also remind them that wherever they are in their understanding of racial inequality, wherever they are, that's fine. But once they recognize where they are, they then have a responsibility to move forward.
What would thrill you to see the church do moving forward?
Keep the momentum going in regards to the United States of America's greatest ill, which is racism. Continue to have the difficult discussions about racism and its insidious nature. within our culture. For people that aren't in church, it would be the same. And that's every man's created equal. Everyone has basic human rights and civil rights, and that should bring about, regardless of the color. It just so happens that we look, there are things that stick out a little more when it comes to racial inequality. But it still would be justice and righteousness for all.
If someone from the other side,
Yes.
in quotes, someone who maybe doesn't agree with some of the narratives or the statistics, even if they're out there, what would you say to them? I mean, someone who comes in here and just has no background or familiarity with this stuff.
Yeah, so first I would again, I mentioned it earlier, talk about the history of our country with race and politics, right? So there's the 3/5 compromise, where the entire slave population that was then freed, we were only counted as 3/5 of a person, so only 3/5 of that population really, right, would be able to impact an election, taxation, and representation, right? So race played a part right there, where freed slaves, black folks, weren't even considered full humans to be able to exercise what we consider to be, right, like constitutional rights to vote. In that 1968 election, George Wallace, right, the avowed white racist segregationist, the segregation today, segregation to, right, he won 5 states. He was a presidential candidate, and he won 5 states, right, in 1968 because of the backlash of the civil rights legislation in 1964 and 65. That was absolutely one attempt at racial justice through our political system. So I would say, one, we would talk about that history. And that, truthfully, as I said, we've never been like neutral on race in our politics. I said it earlier. I don't believe we would have politics if we didn't have race. Because if we look at our country's history, like, race has played a part every step along the way in our political existence and outcomes.
It's just simply a system that has been set up to fail, that has failed the black American. Even after slavery, the laws that were created, that people were free, but they would be once enslaved again if they were criminals. And so you just free people that have nothing, that have been working for free, and then there's a law of vagrancy. So they immediately get locked back up, and they continue to work for free to fuel our society. I would encourage anybody watching this, if you hadn't seen the documentary 13th, you can just see just how entrenched the teeth of slavery and racial inequality are in our great nation.
This is part of what we've inherited, right? And in that sense, I know if I've inherited something that is detrimental to me and my family, like in my lifetime, right? I'm pretty sure I would choose not to pass that down to my children as an inheritance. So that's what we're doing right now in this moment, right? We're choosing not to pass down to our children, right, to the next generation this inheritance of racialized policies and legislations and politics. And so that's the first thing I would say. Is like we have to acknowledge the history, right? Like, those are facts that's documented. You can go Google that right now and you'll see, yes, George Wallace, the one that we all know from all the movies or all the documentaries, all the stories about how racist, right, the South was. George Wallace is the person that comes up in our imagery. He won 5 states, 5 southern states, in a presidential election in 1968. So that's our history. And then the other thing I would say is, like, we see those effects to today.
Yeah, it's a very tedious process because, my oldest child is 13, my youngest one is 7. I don't want them to, they can't see what I see. They can't comprehend what I can comprehend. So I think the first thing that I put in their heart is love. One of the statements that's repeated around my house as we talk about racial things, and that's all white people aren't good and all black people aren't bad. And then I could say it the reverse way: all black people aren't good and all white people aren't bad. So even though I know what the ills are in our society, my children, their foundation is love. Their foundation is compassion. Their foundation is open-mindedness. Their foundation is God created all people. And their foundation is an understanding of sin. So see, what we're seeing in society is not necessarily black and white. However, that's just how sin is having it play itself out. So see, we're able to strip the physicalities off of this, and they understand that it's a physical warfare. So that's why I tell them that way. So that's how we talk about racial things. And it's just the fact that we are judged based upon the color of our skin. Nevertheless, we don't allow that fact to cause us to hate anyone or hate anything, but it is in fact a reality.
Our society, there is no data, I believe, that you can find that doesn't show disparities between white and people of color. In particular, when we talk about those key areas of existence that we all have to engage with, right? Education, right? Disparities exist. Legislation can be done to undo that. Mass incarceration. Legislation can be done to undo that. Health outcomes. Legislation can be done. Housing. Legislation can be done. Matter of fact, legislation was put into place, statutes, policies that allowed housing to be racially segregated. We can undo that. Income, right? Like all these sorts of things, all these areas that all of us have to engage with are impacted politically and have been impacted politically by racially unjust policies. And so if we're looking at our current situation and how we are looking to dismantle systems that have perpetuated race and racialized outcomes, to me it only makes sense that the political arena would not be left untouched.
I definitely believe that politics should be separate from the pulpit. However, justice and righteousness are the twin towers of God's character. And so as we observe things in our community, in our region, in our state, and in our world, we have to look at them, or actually be shown them, through the eyes of justice and righteousness. And God is the final authority of that. And so that's how I would answer that. Those things that fall in the area of politics, I'm simply attempting to be obedient to the just outcome that God would desire, the righteous outcome that God would desire in different areas of society. There are no perfect candidates. There's no perfect system. And so it becomes real personal. But there's certain convictions that I think we must stand upon. But it gets kind of tricky. And it's really a personal allegiance to the Lord in your life, who the Lord is to you in your life. The great Martin Luther King, it was simply about what's right and what's wrong. And once again, what do I identify myself with? What am I willing to hang my hat on? Am I willing to hang my hat on my race? Am I willing to hang my hat on my political party? Am I willing to hang my hat on my socioeconomical status? See, so now it begins to get closer. And that's the challenge for the believer. I must hang my hat on the things that God hangs his hat on. And ultimately, the bedrock of any situation and or circumstance is God's righteousness and God's justice. And so therein lies the challenge. Who or whom am I willing to be identified with?
Yeah. You know, we've all heard this, like the white evangelical vote has really hung their hat on, for instance, the current administration. How do you reconcile kind of this profession of evangelical values with what's playing out in our country?
There's a new scripture that I found that might hit on that, and that's Psalms 140 verse 12, and I'll read it. It says, I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. Surely the righteous will give thanks to thy name, the upright will dwell in thy presence. So that's Psalms 140 verses 12 and 13, and if we just listen to that, in the 12th verse it says, I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. So just spiritually speaking, God is for the afflicted, and God is going to bring justice to the poor. So when we start thinking about policies and things that are transpiring without even mentioning any names, not even mentioning any offices, do we see in our current office, do we see in our current administration the afflicted, the causes for the afflicted being maintained? Or do we see causes for the poor, justice being carried out for the poor. Not just the current administration, every administration.
Is it as simple as, because there might still be people that say, yes, George Wallace was voted in back then, but there is no more segregation. There is no. I'm playing devil's advocate
yeah, absolutely.
here.
I would simply say
Because is it as simple as they need to come into an office and talk to someone that doesn't look like them, or
I don't think it's that simple. Unfortunately, I think and I think we're seeing that in our current political climate, right? As we see policies and legislation and rhetoric, right, that clearly has racial language in it. Let's talk about the virus, right? The coronavirus. I mean, how has that been referenced by some folks? I mean, I've heard our national leadership and folks within the party that national leadership belongs to refer to it as the China virus, the Asian, it's and we know viruses, right, don't have an ethnicity, right? We know better, we do better now, right? So folks go back to what we called the Spanish influenza in 1918. Yes, we did, and we know better, we do better. We acknowledge that wasn't it, that actually the Spanish influenza didn't start in, right? So I think it didn't start in Spain, let me finish. It didn't start there, right? And so I think part of it is that we have to, we simply lay out some things to say, I can tell you, right, that referencing the virus in the way it has increased discrimination against folks of Asian descent and Asian Americans. That's race playing out currently in politics in our political body. So my thing would be that yes, George Wallace was back then, that we may have a George Wallace now, right? But the idea is, but that it is not simply as clean cut. And that's the other thing I think, right? So someone would say, I don't want folks to, because I think sometimes what I hear in that sentiment is that was back then, that, hey, we have this clear demarcation where we stop being racist as a country. And there is no such clear demarcation.
But based on, a lot of reading and research, I think there's sort of three things going into the racism issue, right? On one hand, there is what I would call overt explicit racism. And that's, when you say the word racism, that's sort of what immediately comes to mind for people, right? They think KKK, they think, lynching, that's kind of what they have in mind. And for most people, that's bad, right? Rightly so. But for most people, they imagine that in the past, right? And I would argue that kind of explicit racism still exists today. It might use more coded language, so it might not be as obvious as it was, although sometimes it's very obvious. There was just a case just this weekend in Marshall, Minnesota, where people were in Walmart wearing a swastika on their face mask, right? So sometimes it's very obvious, but sometimes it's more coded, right? It comes in sort of language, or what you might have heard of as the Southern strategy, that came up from Nixon and has been used for many years, about sort of using that more coded language to talk about race. So if you're talking about thugs, if you're talking about ghettos, right? It's law and order would be another example, right? So it's not as overt, but it's still overt racism. So that's a problem. A second problem that's part of this is what we would call implicit bias. So these are the types of biases that exist subconsciously or unconsciously, and psychologists have done a really great job of studying implicit bias, right? These are the things that we're not intentionally trying to be racist, but it's just kind of happening because that's what we've been taught. So those are the kinds of things like, if you see somebody of a different race walking toward you, you grab your purse or you cross the street. Or in the world of commerce, it's where you have a black sounding name and you're applying for a job and you're less likely to get that job. Lots of studies that have been done where they've paired resumes that are identical with a black sounding name and a white sounding name, and statistically they're able to find that there is this implicit bias, right? Hiring managers who tend to be white are more likely to hire this white sounding name than the black sounding name. So not overt in the way we think of racism, but still having these really serious effects. And then the third category I'd put is these systemic pieces that are like, they're not explicitly race-based, but they have racial implications, right? And so those three pieces, the explicit racism, the implicit bias, and the structural pieces come together to create the system. You're going to have some candidates that come out with those explicitly racist statements. And they are using code language generally. And I do think that you need to call those out.
If we want to look at the election of the first black president, a campaign quickly arose to try and delegitimize him through a whole host of things. He didn't graduate from the school he went to. He didn't get the grades he went to. But like the most insidious thing was that he wasn't born here, right? That he was not one of us. And so there became this campaign of like, we need to see his birth certificate. We need to see his birth certificate. It's called birtherism, right? And matter of fact, I think at one point, 40% of a particular party believed he was not born in this country. Like, they also believed he was a Muslim. And like all this stuff, right, that was clearly racialized in language, that he became president, but he is not legitimate because he was not born here, was absolutely a racial thing. And then even after he provided evidence, right, some folks still didn't believe it. And the thing I always ask is, how many other presidents were asked to prove they were born here?
Well, yeah, zero.
Zero, right? Yeah. Zero were asked to prove that they were born here. And then we look at some of the racist backlash that began, right? That there were folks, I believe, under the guise of fiscal responsibility, right? But we understand in the rhetoric and some of the things that came out that it wasn't fiscal responsibility, right? I remember one particular political pundit called the first black president the food stamp president. You're telling me that that's not racialized language? You're telling me that's not acknowledging race, right? Playing off this myth that more black folks are on food stamps and take advantage of the system. If you look at the numbers, that's not the case, right? More white Americans utilize food stamps and food supplement programs than but that's what I would say to folks who would say, well, man, no, these still have continued forward. I mean, we had our the current president at a rally say, I'm a nationalist. He didn't run from that, right? We know that that's racialized language.
That coded language is communicating a message. The word we use in contemporary politics is the dog whistle politics, right? They're using that to talk to a particular base. I think it's important to call that out. The second category, the implicit bias, I also think this is important to point out, because this is the kind of bias that people generally don't recognize that they have, but they do. And it's not because they're mean-spirited or because they want bad things for other racial groups. It's because of socialization. It's because of, what they've grown up with. And if we don't call those things out, then you're just going to replicate them.
Why is it, and the question I would have, why is it we don't believe, right, even after provided evidence, why would we not believe Barack Obama, right, wasn't born in this country and worthy of being president? If a birth certificate is not enough, if college grades are not enough, if all these things are not enough for you to believe he is fully human and he is fully capable, then yes, it is race that is stopping you from acknowledging that. Because with anyone else, if I provide a birth certificate, if I had these images and visuals from both college and post-college, and I've been here, my mom was born here, my mom is from Kansas, right? All of those things, we would not question that, right? In particular, white minds would not question that. But because he was black, white minds questioned it. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, it's because of race, right? And race has distorted so many things in our minds about each other.
And then the structural pieces absolutely need, we need to speak up when we see that there are racial disparities that are the result of structural policies. That's our job to make sure that a policy that's designed to be neutral actually succeeds in being neutral, because if it doesn't have neutral outcomes, it's a bad policy and it needs to be changed.
And so folks going into the booth, again, it's do your research, right? Like who is putting forth policies and platforms that address race, that acknowledges an issue, and it always has been an issue in our communities, and we get disparate outcomes based on that, and that now we have to do things to move forward, right? And legislation plays a part in that, community organizing plays a part, but this legislative piece and policies, like do that homework, and really the tough part is acknowledge that it's real. I think there's still a lot of folks who believe that race isn't real, or that they don't want to believe that we as a collective of humans, right, would use something as race to have predictable outcomes, like diametrically different outcomes for someone who's white and who's black. So they may not want to admit it, or else it is a power thing, right? That I think one of the things that we've seen is the power of being the majority and what being the majority can provide. The 3/5 compromise was we want to stay majority, because if we provide freed slaves and black folks, all of them the right to vote, we would no longer have the power as majority to dictate what we do as a country. And so let's not make them full citizens, because that's the way we keep power.
A lot of people that are watching probably are already prepared to use their vote to try and, fix some of these things. On one hand, it seems like when there's so many categories here and it's so overwhelming, it almost feels like how do you weigh this against any other thing you're voting for? I mean, because it sounds so huge and like it requires everyone's 110% investment. How do you weigh that when you're going to the polls?
I don't know that it's an either or kind of situation, right? Because as I mentioned, every issue has racial dynamics to it.
Yeah.
I can't think of an issue that doesn't have racial dynamics to it. I'm teaching a class on food and politics this fall. We're doing our entire class focused on the racial dynamics of that, right? So immigration and labor policy, health disparity in access to food and food deserts, lending policies from the Small Business Administration and how they distribute funds. Like every issue you could possibly think of that you care about, it has racial dimensions to it. So I don't think that it's an either or kind of situation. I think it's a both and, right? I personally care a lot about child welfare policy. I care a lot about child protection legislation. That has racial dynamics, right? Because if our child protection system is designed to surveil a certain type of person more closely and to remove those kids from homes, what you're going to have is more removals of black families or more breakup of black families than you are of white families, even if child abuse rates are the same in both. And so any issue you care about, I don't think you have to choose, I care about racial justice or this issue. I think it's both. I care about this issue and I am aware and I care about the racial disparities in this issue.
Yeah.
Most people don't have time to go and learn about every single issue. You just don't. You have life, right? So in political science, we call that we're low information voters. And some people would look at that and be pretty hard on people for being low information voters. Like, you should go out and you learn everything about every issue. Yeah. I think that's pretty unrealistic, right? I think you have a job. My job is to learn about politics. I get paid to do that. And even I can't learn about every single issue and every candidate's stance on every issue. But most people have a real job and they have families and they have hobbies. And so you just can't do that. And so you do have to make some, what we would call cognitive shortcuts, right? You have to find some heuristics that you can use or shortcut voting techniques that you can use in order to make those decisions. So I think it's okay to think about the issues that you care the most about and try and learn about just those issues and find out where your candidates stand on those issues to make a decision. I also think it's okay to use shortcuts like finding an advocacy group that you feel represents your position on in their approach to the world, and then using their resources, because advocacy groups have resources, to do some of that culling of information, to look through what candidates say, right? They send out questionnaires to candidates, and they find out how they feel about different positions. And so use the work that they've done, and you look at their recommendations. Who are the leaders of those groups recommending? What does their research say about those different candidate positions? Because we're in a world of information overload. I think it's unrealistic to expect somebody to be able to do all that research on every single issue for every single candidate.
Yeah.
And political parties serve that function too, right? If there's a political party that you feel like sort of captures most of your issues, that's why we have political parties. It's a shortcut. It sort of says members of this political party in general feel this way about issues. I think the popular approach tends to look down on using those shortcuts, but I think from a political science perspective, it's actually a really smart way of making decisions, because you don't have unlimited time and resources to do that research. One of the issues that I think is really important that with this next election that people aren't necessarily thinking about is the issue of reapportionment and redistricting. So right now we're in the middle of a census, and the Constitution requires that every 10 years the US government takes a census, so counts all of the people living in the country. And then based on that information, they allocate seats around the country. So there's 435 seats in the House of Representatives. That's a fixed number, and so that just gets moved around based on where the population is. That's called reapportionment. Once the census is taken and you look at where the population is, and Congress says, all right, every state gets this number of representatives, the next step is to redraw the district lines to reflect the population shifts within a state. So that's called redistricting. And it's a very important process, because district lines are not neutral. They have to be drawn, according to the Supreme Court, they have to be drawn so that they have equal population within each district. So they have to be, what they call it is one person, one vote. So you take a district, and each district within a state has to have the same population. But where those lines are drawn and which group of people are within each district is really important, because you can draw those district lines in a way that basically skews who wins that district. And the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't do it according to race, in that you can't draw those district lines to dilute the votes of minority voters. Okay? You can create minority majority districts, basically districts where the majority of the population is the same race, so that you have a higher chance of electing a non-white representative from that area. But they haven't said that it's illegal or unconstitutional to draw lines according to party. And so that's where you have really smart people using lots of software and data points to draw district lines to protect members of their political party. Okay, so that's about to happen. We're taking the census right now. We're going to have an election in November, and next year, based on the results of the census, every state in the country, except for the states that only get one representative because they have such a small population, but every other state in the country is going to be redrawing their district lines. And in 35 of the states, that process of redrawing district lines is done by the state legislature. It's a political process. It's a partisan process. And so this election matters more than many elections, because the control of those lines is going to be by whoever wins the next election. So it's another thing to think about, according to your, in addition to all the issues you care about. Like in Wisconsin, I don't know the exact numbers, but Democrats won about 60% of the vote in Wisconsin and won about 40% of the seats in the Wisconsin legislature. Okay? So, and that's because of how those state lines were drawn in the legislature. So that's not at the federal level, it's at the state level. Yeah. But what you will end up having is more situations like that. You're going to have situations where you have one political party that has some racial implications to it, that is going to be able to draw the lines in ways that are favorable to them, and that disenfranchises a lot of people. So I'm saying this election chooses, in most states, this election, this November, chooses the people that are going to draw those lines.
Sure.
So the thing that leaves me hopeful is, one, that I find more and more folks who are willing to engage uncomfortably on race, and in particular white folks, right? I see so many more of my white brothers and sisters who are saying, in essence, man, I apologize for being like oblivious for so long. And to me, that brings me hope.
It's no longer just black against white. It's everybody versus racism. And so I really have to, if I'm Caucasian, I really have to listen to my brothers and sisters that are black, and really take on the posture of humility, and really choose to become an ally for them. And that takes a certain type of open-mindedness and willingness to understand someone else's situation or circumstance. It's kind of like being an advocate. When you choose to be an advocate for someone, you're privy to what they are not able to do and what is affecting them. You're privy to speak in areas that they are not able to speak. You're privy to advocate for them. And so there's some steps, and there's some layers, and there's some growth that must come about for one to be an advocate, for one to be an ally. So I would urge my dear Caucasian brothers and sisters to truly listen to those closest to them that are black.
It has to get better. Do you know what I mean? Like, in some ways, I'm like, the optimist in me says, like, it has to be better. Like, we have to, like, we are going to do better, right? And so I think part of it is that's what leaves me hopeful, right? Is that, one, we're growing this coalition of folks who are ready to admit that race is like producing outcomes that do inequitably, and that I want to be part of that solution. So that coalition building, and then that we see that how bad it is right now, right, in the analogy of a new morning, right, at its darkest point, there's things that happen that rejuvenate us, that allow us to re-engage, to bring about this new morning. And I think that would be the other thing, right, is that the sun rises and we rise with it.
Hi, my name's Emily Falk, and I'm a junior at Gustavus Adolphus College with a triple major in political science, Spanish, and Latin American, Latinx, and Caribbean studies with a history minor. I'm also a member of the Indivisible leadership team. What led me to participate in Indivisible, I think, was going to Gustavus, right? I found a lot of different opportunities to be involved on campus, but that kind of left me wanting more, wanting to get involved with the St. Peter community and with those folks in Mankato as well. And so I started going to the Thursday demos during this J term and kind of ended up on the leadership team. And I consider it a great privilege because I know that Indivisible embodies the true spirit of community, right? We support one another, we lift each other up, and we amplify one another's voices. And I think that we've always been working for racial justice in our world because we understand that as a community, right, supporting one another means not tolerating when members of your community are being hurt, specifically Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color. And I think that's why we've always prioritized civic engagement, especially at the polls, not just in local and state elections, but also federally. And it's another reason why we decided to start the Postcard Project. So the Postcard Project is really fun. It's myself and a group of others who basically decided, hey, let's get folks who are registered to vote, who didn't vote in our last election, let's get them at the polls, right? Like, it's not just engaging the folks who are already in your group, it's engaging everyone. And so what we've done is we've recruited some postcard writers, and they are mailing out postcards talking about the importance of voting, and hopefully we will see them at the polls. But it's been a great way for people to connect with one another and to be able to do something from home, right? I feel like during a pandemic, everyone's inside a whole lot, and sometimes you feel helpless, like you can't do anything to make change or to affect change in your community. But we've done this to show, yeah, you can. This is how you can reach out to your neighbors. This is how you can engage in social justice work at home. And it's just as simple as writing a postcard. And it's been really wonderful to see folks really turn out for this, not just volunteering to write postcards, but with donations on our GoFundMe page or our Act Blue page. It's been a really wonderful experience.
Well, I just want to thank each and every speaker that was involved. They lent their time, their wisdom, their resources to this discussion. I hope that you gained something out of it. I also want to thank Indivisible for helping kind of host this. I mean, this is Indivisible St. Peter, Greater Mankato. They're committed to creating a more inclusive, equitable world, and that starts locally in our community. And so you may not have to completely agree with everything that every one of these speakers says. You might not even have to agree completely with everything that Indivisible says or that I might say in our conversations. But the point is, racial justice, this is a conversation we want to continue. Pastor Maurice Staley talked about keeping the momentum going. And that applies to not only inside the church, but outside it. And so regardless of your faith, regardless of your background, if this is something that is now stirring you, I would just encourage you, continue this dialogue. We're having this conversation right now on the 401st anniversary of when the first Africans were brought onto what would become American soil to be enslaved. Obviously, that was the start of injustice, of this devaluing. And so we see these carryover effects. We want to not just talk about them, but do something about it. And so any of these speakers I know would be happy to continue to engage in dialogue if you were interested. I know Indivisible would be happy to do that. I would love to have conversations with people. But let's also partner with the community to move forward. Thank you so much to everyone who's given their time, perhaps even their money to this cause. And let's continue to stand and be indivisible for justice.